Good morning. Good morning and welcome to day 10 of our Bible study. We finished Philippians yesterday, and so today we're going to start on something new. We're going to start on the Gospel of Mark, and we'll be in Mark chapter 1 this morning, verses 1 through 13. I want to tell you about the very first time I ever had to stand in front of people in a church. I was about 14 years old. Our youth group was doing a youth Sunday, and I was in charge of doing the prayer requests. And so I'm standing up in front of this church, and I'm reading a list that somebody had given me of all the people in the church that needed prayers. I'm 14. I don't know who the people are. And one of the people on there was some sweet little old lady who I've never heard of. And apparently she was in the hospital, and she probably wasn't going to live through the day. And so as I got up there, I said, we need to pray for Agnes. I don't even remember what her name was. Her family is gathered at the hospital. She's probably not going to live through today, so please pray for them. And right when I got finished saying that, somebody said, she's here. She's what now? Yeah, she's here. And then this sweet little old lady sitting in the fourth row stands up and starts waving at me. She's right there. The woman who's not supposed to live through the day is right there. So what do I do at that moment? I don't think I handled it well, but I do remember how I handled it. As after they said she's here, and here's this lady that I told everyone is dying is standing up waving at me. I looked at her and said, "So you feeling better?" The point of that story is this. Sometimes you say things and they are immediately contradicted. And most of the time when that happens, it's because you're wrong. But in this passage that we're going to look at today, Mark starts out his gospel by saying something that is going to contradict everything I'm about to tell you. And you think, well then, you're wrong, aren't you, Chris? Well, let's just talk about it. Mark's gospel. Now, Mark was one of what was called the synoptic gospels. They were Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and synoptic means similar. They were very much alike. But each one of these gospels was written to a different audience. Matthew was written primarily to Jews, where he's proving to the Jewish people that Jesus is the Messiah. Luke was written primarily to Greeks, where he's proving to Greek people that Jesus is a leader, a teacher worth following. And then we have Mark. Mark was written primarily to Romans. Romans would not be interested in Jewish theology like Matthew's readers would. Romans were interested in having a conqueror, having the right guy to follow. Romans were interested in power, and so Mark throughout his gospel shows the power of Jesus. They would not be interested in Jewish theology. So let's look immediately at verses 1 and the first part of verse 2. The beginning of the good news about Jesus, the Messiah. Mark starts right away with using a Jewish term that his Roman readers wouldn't be terribly familiar with. The Messiah, the Son of God. As it is written in Isaiah, the prophet. Okay, now he quotes a Jewish prophet that, again, his Roman audience wouldn't be familiar with, nor would they be interested in. So why all of a sudden, why is Mark throwing all this Jewish theology at a Roman audience right off the bat? Well, something you have to remember about Romans. The city of Rome was the most important city in the world at the time. And if the gospel was going to spread across the civilized world, across the known world at the time, the first place it really needed to go that would be key to getting it out everywhere was the city of Rome. So it was key, absolutely vital, that the gospel reach out to the Romans and appeal to them, because if it can get a foothold in Rome, it's going to go everywhere. So again, we come back to the question, well then why is Mark starting out by talking about something they would not be familiar with, Jewish theology? What would have appealed to this audience? Well, again, the Romans were people who were drawn to two things, power and conquest. Power and conquest. The Romans were used to going in and taking over lands. The Romans were used to being the world leaders, to being the leaders of this empire. And they were used to having strong leaders. That was inbred into the Roman mentality, that we need strong leaders that we can follow into battle that will bring us victory. So what would they be looking for in Jesus? Now, in Luke's gospel, they were looking for philosophy. They wouldn't be looking for that here. What were they looking for in Mark's gospel? They would want to know what kind of a leader Jesus was, and particularly, is this Jesus worth following? And this is why Mark introduces him as the Messiah. You see, you need to understand the Messiah is not just some term from Jewish history. You need to understand what the Messiah is. He's a Savior, a man of power. And Mark, even though he's using a Jewish term, is going to build his argument throughout this gospel of saying, this is the guy. This is the one we want to follow. Let's follow him. Notice he doesn't call him just the Messiah in verse 1. He also calls him the Son of God. That's a title that will get the attention of the Romans. He has godlike powers. Oh, even more than that. He's the Son of God. Let's talk about what that means. And let's look even at the prophecy. He talks about what Isaiah said about the coming of the Messiah. He says there in verse 2, I will send my messenger ahead of you who will prepare your way. A voice of one calling in the wilderness, prepare the way for the Lord, make straight paths for him. That imagery right there would click with the Roman readers. They were used to the idea if a king was going to go and visit a city, he would send a messenger like a year ahead of time that I'm planning to visit there next year. Get your roads in shape. Get your roads fixed so that I can come and be. This idea of preparing the way for the king was inherent in Roman thinking. So Mark takes that prophecy and says, look, Jesus is a king. You know how kings get things ready for their appearance. This is what Jesus was doing. This is what God was doing when he sent John the Baptist to get people ready for Jesus. Now, Mark talks about John the Baptist and what he was doing quite a bit here, but I want to pick it up. When Jesus encounters John in verse 9, look at verses 9 down through 11. At that time, Jesus came from Nazareth in Galilee and was baptized by John in the Jordan. Just as Jesus was coming up out of the water, he saw heaven being torn open and the Spirit descending on him like a dove. And a voice came from heaven, You are my Son, whom I love. With you I am well pleased. Jesus is baptized, and God himself booms from heaven in a loud voice. This is getting the attention of the Romans. They're now seeing Jesus as he's a man of power. He's a man of power and strength and wisdom. And this is the picture that Mark is going to paint of Jesus throughout his gospel. We often think of Jesus as this gentle, mild, meek, vaguely Swedish-looking guy. He's in the movies, he's always petting lambs and he's holding children on his laps, and he never talks in a tone of voice above this, and he never gets angry, and he's always very quiet and meek and so wise and really, really boring. That is not Jesus. The Jesus that we see in Mark's gospel was a leader. The Jesus that we see in Mark's gospel was never boring. You could just feel the power crackling off him. Jesus in Mark's gospel, I'll be honest with you, is somebody who's a little frightening to be around. He's like the teacher you may have had that if you got the question wrong, you would get that look and you'd be a little scared. We see that with Jesus. He says time after time to his disciples, how long do I have to put up with you, you unbelieving generation? An unbelieving generation was their way of back then saying, you bunch of knuckleheads. Jesus was not afraid of speaking his mind. Jesus stood in front of the Pharisees and said, you guys are wrong. Jesus went into the temple leaders and told them, you guys are wrong. He had no problem with saying that. Jesus was a man of phenomenal courage. Jesus, think about this. Jesus told the weather to knock it off. Jesus was a man of power, and the Romans could relate to that. They could feel that. If you ever read C.S. Lewis's books, they're really considered children's books, but they're amazing books, the Chronicles of Narnia. And in the very first one, The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, he describes Aslan, and Aslan is seen as a symbol for Christ. He describes Aslan this way. It's Mr. Beaver is talking to Lucy, one of the children in the book, about Aslan, about what he's like. And he says, if there's anyone who can appear before Aslan without their knees knocking, they're either braver than me or just silly. Lucy asks, then he isn't safe? Safe, said Mr. Beaver. Didn't you hear what Mrs. Beaver tells you? Who said anything about safe? Of course he isn't safe, but he's good. He's the king, I tell you. See, that's Jesus right there. He's not safe. He's power, and you can feel that power. And there's a little bit of fear of being around him because this is a man who is not afraid of the leaders. He's not afraid to speak his mind. This is a man of power and of strength, and this is who the Romans are hearing about, and they're interested now. Is this a guy worth following? Yes, he is. So my question to you today, is Jesus a man worth following? Because I'll tell you right now, we need leaders. We need leaders that are worth following, especially in the midst of this crisis. We need people of integrity. We need people of great courage. And folks, I want to tell you, that's what we have in Jesus. He is worth following. God bless you. I'll see you again on Monday, and we will pick up our study of Mark's Gospel then. Have a great weekend. Stay positive.